In June 1978, Argentina hosted the World Cup for the first time. Stadiums were packed. The host nation went all the way to the final and won. By every conventional measure, it should be remembered as one of the great triumphant World Cup stories. Except less than a mile from the stadium where Argentina played some of its biggest matches, a military dictatorship was running a secret detention center where thousands of people were tortured, and where many of them were killed and simply made to disappear. This is the story of the 1978 World Cup, a tournament that unfolded almost entirely in the shadow of one of the darkest periods in Argentine history, and a story that, decades later, Argentina is still trying to figure out how to remember. To understand this story properly, you have to hold two facts in your head at the same time, because that's genuinely what Argentina had to do in the summer of 1978. On one hand, a genuinely thrilling, historic sporting achievement, Argentina's first World Cup title, won on home soil, in front of a passionate home crowd. On the other hand, a military government that had seized power 2 years earlier and was, during the very weeks of that tournament, actively running a systemic campaign of kidnapping, torture, and killing against its own citizens. This video isn't going to pretend those two things existed separately from each other. They didn't. Understanding the 1978 World Cup means understanding both halves of that story together, and grappling honestly with a question Argentina itself has debated for decades. What does it mean to celebrate a sporting triumph that a brutal government used, quite deliberately, to help legitimize itself to the world? Argentina was actually awarded the rights to host the 1978 World Cup back in 1966, more than a decade before the tournament actually took place, and years before the military government that would eventually run the country even existed. At the time of the bid, Argentina had a democratically elected civilian government, and the country's passionate football culture made it a natural, largely uncontroversial choice as host. But the political situation in Argentina changed dramatically in the years between that hosting decision and the tournament itself. On March 24, 1976, just 2 years before the World Cup was scheduled to begin, a military coup overthrew Argentina's sitting president, Isabel Perón. A military junta led by Lieutenant General Jorge Rafael Videla seized control of the country, framing the takeover as a necessary response to political instability and violence that had plagued Argentina throughout the preceding years. What followed, in reality, was the beginning of what's now widely known as Argentina's Dirty War, a systematic campaign by the military government to identify, detain, torture, and in many cases kill anyone suspected of political opposition, left-wing sympathies, or any activity the regime considered a threat to its authority. Estimates of the total number of victims vary, but human rights organizations and later Argentine government investigations have documented thousands of confirmed forced disappearances, with some broader estimates suggesting the true total may be considerably higher. By the time the 1978 World Cup actually kicked off, the military junta had been in power for a little over 2 years and had already established the machinery of repression that would come to define its rule. The government inherited the hosting rights to a tournament it had no role in originally winning, and quickly recognized the propaganda value the event could offer. For a regime facing growing international criticism over human rights abuses, hosting a global sporting event watched by hundreds of millions of people represented an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to present a very different image of Argentina to the world, one of national pride, festive celebration, and normalcy, rather than the reality of secret detention centers and mass disappearances happening just outside the television camera's frame. This dynamic, a government using a major sporting event to project a curated, positive national image while obscuring darker realities, has since become widely studied and referred to in political and sports literature as sports washing, and the 1978 World Cup is frequently cited as one of the most striking historical examples of the phenomenon. Here is one of the most haunting and well-documented facts in this entire story. El Monumental, Argentina's largest stadium and the venue for many of the tournament's biggest matches, including the final itself, sat less than a mile away from a building known as the Naval Mechanics School, a facility that, during this period, functioned as one of the regime's most notorious clandestine detention and torture centers. Historical accounts and testimony collected in the years since suggest that thousands of prisoners were held at this facility between 1976 and 1983, with only a small fraction of those detained there ever being released alive. According to accounts collected from survivors in the years since, prisoners held at the facility could reportedly hear the roar of stadium crowds during World Cup matches, celebrating a national triumph unfolding just a short distance from where they were being held. It's difficult to fully convey the surreal, devastating juxtaposition this represents. A nation celebrating football glory in a stadium a few minutes' walk from a facility where the same government hosting that celebration was simultaneously torturing and killing its own citizens. This detail, more than almost any other single fact connected to the tournament, has come to define how many historians and journalists discuss the legacy of Argentina 1978. Given everything already known internationally about Argentina's human rights situation by 1978, there were calls, both inside and outside the country, for teams and federations to consider boycotting the tournament entirely. Human rights organizations, exiled Argentine dissidents, and some European political figures argued that participating in the tournament risked legitimizing the junta's rule on the world stage. In the end, no national team formally boycotted the tournament, and it proceeded with all qualified nations participating. FIFA's president at the time, Johan Cruyff, defended the decision to proceed with the tournament as planned, and no formal investigation was launched by football's governing body into the political circumstances surrounding the host nation. However, individual players did make their own choices. Perhaps the most famous example is Johan Cruyff, the legendary Dutch player who was widely assumed for decades to have skipped the 1978 World Cup for principled political reasons, refusing to play in a tournament hosted by a military dictatorship. For 30 years, that was the accepted explanation, and Cruyff largely allowed it to stand without public correction. It wasn't until 2008, 3 decades later, that Cruyff finally revealed the real reason in a Catalan radio interview. Armed intruders had broken into his home in Barcelona in 1977 in an incident connected to political violence and kidnapping threats targeting wealthy or prominent public figures during that period. Cruyff described the terrifying experience of having a weapon pointed at him while his wife and children were held nearby during the break-in. He retired from international football later that year, and for 30 years allowed the public to believe his absence from the 1978 World Cup was a political statement, rather than revealing the deeply personal trauma that had actually driven his decision. Argentina in 1978 kicked off on June 1st, featuring 16 national teams across the tournament's opening group stage, including first-time participants Iran and Tunisia, with Tunisia making history by becoming the first African nation ever to win a World Cup match, defeating Mexico 3-1 in the group stage. For Argentina's own team, coached by Cesar Luis Menotti and led by players including Mario Kempes, Daniel Passarella, and Osvaldo Ardiles, the tournament represented a genuine opportunity for the host nation to win its first World Cup title. Argentina progressed through the opening group stage and advanced into the tournament's second-round group phase, setting up a sequence of matches that would ultimately determine which 2 teams reached the final. This brings us to the single most controversial match in the entire tournament, and one of the most debated matches in World Cup history. Argentina's second-round group match against Peru, played on June 21, 1978, at Estadio Gigante de Arroyito in Rosario. The stakes were mathematically precise and widely understood before kickoff. Argentina needed to defeat Peru by a margin of at least 4 goals in order to overtake Brazil on goal difference and secure their place in the final, rather than Brazil. Complicating matters further, FIFA had scheduled Argentina's match against Peru to kick off after Brazil's own final second-round match against Poland had already concluded. meaning Argentina's players and coaching staff knew exactly what scoreline they needed to achieve before their own match even began. Brazil's team objected to the scheduling arrangement at the time, given the clear competitive advantage it handed their rivals, though the kickoff times had reportedly been agreed upon before the tournament started. Brazil defeated Poland 3-1 earlier that day, meaning Argentina now knew, with mathematical precision, that a 4-0 victory or better over Peru would send them to the final instead of Brazil. What followed has fueled controversy and speculation for decades. Argentina and Peru played out a scoreless first half. Then, in the second half, Argentina's attack suddenly clicked into overdrive, scoring 6 unanswered goals, a dramatic, lopsided collapse from a Peruvian side that, up to that point in the tournament, had shown itself to be a genuinely competitive team. The scale and timing of Argentina's 6-0 victory immediately raised eyebrows across the football world, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the match multiplied in the years that followed as more details emerged. Peru's starting goalkeeper that day, Ramon Quiroga, had actually been born in Argentina himself, a detail that fueled speculation, though it should be noted that playing for a country other than one's birth nation isn't inherently evidence of wrongdoing on its own. According to reporting that emerged in the years and decades following the tournament, Argentina's military government allegedly shipped a substantial quantity of grain to Peru in the period immediately following the match. Reported figures suggest as much as 35,000 tons, while the Central Bank of Argentina also reportedly released tens of millions of dollars in frozen Peruvian financial assets around the same time. A Peruvian trade unionist who later became a senator, Genaro Ledesma, went further still, alleging that more than a dozen Peruvian political prisoners had also been quietly transferred to Argentine custody as part of a broader arrangement connected to the match, an allegation that Peru's own military ruler at the time always denied. Perhaps most strikingly, journalists and historians have documented that Argentina's dictator, Jorge Videla, personally visited the Peruvian team's locker room shortly before kickoff, accompanied by former United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, delivering what was described as a message of goodwill from Peru's own military ruler, Francisco Morales Bermudez, an extraordinary, highly unusual gesture immediately before a decisive World Cup match, with the host nation's own advancement directly on the line. It's important, in telling this story honestly, to be precise about what has actually been proven versus what remains allegation and speculation, because this distinction matters enormously and is often blurred in popular retellings. No formal investigation, either at the time or in the decades since, has ever definitively proven that the Argentina-Peru match was fixed in any legally established sense. Several players from both teams, interviewed over the years, have firmly denied any arrangement took place, insisting Argentina was simply the stronger side that night, playing with the enormous emotional lift of a raucous home crowd and everything on the line. At the same time, the circumstantial details surrounding the match, the mathematically convenient scheduling, the dramatic second-half collapse from a previously competitive Peruvian side, the reported financial and grain transfers, Videla's personal locker room visit, and persistent testimony alleging political prisoner transfers, have collectively kept this controversy alive and actively debated for over 4 decades. As recently as the early 2000s, Argentine judicial authorities opened a formal investigation specifically examining the allegations surrounding the match, though that investigation, like previous inquiries, has not produced conclusive, universally accepted findings. What can be said with confidence is this: even setting aside the specific question of whether the match itself was manipulated, the surrounding atmosphere, Peru's team reportedly losing their hotel security detail without explanation the night before the match, and their team bus experiencing unexplained, lengthy delays reaching the stadium on match day, paints a picture of an environment where irregular, troubling things were clearly happening around this specific fixture, regardless of what ultimately happened on the actual scoreboard. Argentina's 6-0 victory over Peru sent them into the World Cup final, where they faced the Netherlands, the same Dutch team that had reached the final without Johan Cruyff, their biggest star, following his decision not to participate in the tournament at all. The final, played at El Monumental in Buenos Aires on June 25, 1978, finished 1-1 after 90 minutes of regulation play, sending the match into extra time. In extra time, Argentina scored twice more, ultimately winning 3-1 and securing the nation's first-ever World Cup title. Mario Kempes, Argentina's star forward, scored twice in the final and finished as the tournament's leading goalscorer overall, becoming, in the immediate aftermath, a genuine national hero. The celebrations that followed across Argentina were, by every account, massive, spontaneous, and genuinely joyful. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary Argentines pouring into the streets to celebrate their country's first World Cup title, a moment of authentic national pride and football euphoria that, for millions of people in the crowd, existed entirely separately from any awareness of, or complicity in, the atrocities their government was simultaneously committing. For the military junta, Argentina's championship victory represented an enormous propaganda opportunity, and the government moved quickly and deliberately to capitalize on it. Videla appeared prominently and repeatedly throughout the tournament, receiving standing ovations at matches, and publicly dismissed growing international reports of his regime's human rights abuses as what he characterized as an anti-Argentine conspiracy designed to damage the country's international reputation. The genuine, widespread public joy surrounding Argentina's championship became, in the hands of the regime, a powerful tool for suggesting to both domestic and international audiences that Argentina under military rule was a stable, thriving, unified nation, a deliberate obscuring of the systematic repression occurring simultaneously, often just streets away from where celebrating crowds gathered. Human rights organizations did attempt to use the World Cup's unprecedented global media attention as a counter-opportunity of their own, drawing international journalists' attention to the regime's abuses, even while the football tournament dominated headlines, an effort that had some success in raising international awareness, even if it didn't meaningfully alter the regime's conduct in the short term. The military junta that hosted the 1978 World Cup ultimately remained in power until 1983, when it collapsed following Argentina's defeat in the Falklands War against the United Kingdom, paving the way for a return to civilian, democratic government. In the years that followed, Argentina began the long, difficult process of formally documenting and reckoning with the abuses committed during the dictatorship. Truth commissions, courts, and ongoing investigations have, in the decades since, worked to establish an official historical record of what happened during this period, identify victims, and in many cases, prosecute those responsible for the crimes committed. This process, while significant, has also been described by many historians and human rights advocates as incomplete, with elements of Argentina's reckoning with this period of its history still actively unfolding even today. Nearly 5 decades on, Argentina's relationship with the 1978 World Cup remains genuinely complicated, and there's no single, universally agreed-upon way the country has settled on remembering it. For many Argentines, particularly those who lived through the tournament as ordinary football fans with no connection to the political apparatus of the regime, the 1978 title remains a cherished, authentic sporting memory, the country's first World Cup championship, won by a talented team, celebrated by millions of genuinely joyful people. For others, particularly those connected to victims of the dictatorship's abuses, or historians and commentators who've studied the period closely, the tournament remains inseparable from the atrocities that unfolded alongside it, a reminder of how effectively and how cynically a brutal government exploited a moment of authentic national joy for its own propaganda purposes. Both of these perspectives, historians generally agree, contain real truth, and Argentina's ongoing, sometimes uncomfortable process of holding both memories simultaneously, celebrating a genuine sporting triumph while never forgetting the horror unfolding alongside it, has become in itself part of how the country continues to process and remember this specific chapter of its history. It's worth pausing to consider the position Argentina's own players occupied throughout this entire story, because their experience adds an important layer of nuance, often missing from simpler retellings. Many of the players on Argentina's 1978 squad were, by all available accounts, focused entirely on the football itself. Young athletes who had spent years working toward the opportunity to represent their country at a home World Cup, with limited visibility into, or direct involvement with, the political machinery operating around them. Coach Cesar Luis Menotti, notably, was known to hold left-leaning political views that stood in tension with the military government's own ideology, and some accounts from the period suggest a genuinely uneasy relationship between Menotti and the junta throughout the tournament, even as the team he coached delivered the government exactly the propaganda victory it wanted. This tension illustrates just how complicated the relationship between athletes, coaches, and the political forces surrounding them can become, particularly when a government is actively working to associate itself with a team's success, regardless of that team's own political alignment or awareness. For the players themselves, separating personal athletic achievement from the political context surrounding it has remained in the decades since a genuinely difficult needle to thread publicly. Several players from the 1978 squad have, in later interviews and retrospectives, acknowledged the complicated nature of their championship's legacy, while also defending the authenticity of their own sporting achievement and the joy it brought to millions of ordinary Argentine football fans who had no connection to the abuses being carried out by their government. It's also worth understanding what the rest of the world actually knew about Argentina's human rights situation at the time the tournament was taking place, because international awareness of the regime's abuses was considerably more developed by 1978 than popular retelling sometimes suggest. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, had already begun documenting and publicizing reports of systematic disappearances and torture in Argentina well before the tournament kicked off, and some international journalists covering the World Cup itself used their presence in the country to report on the broader political situation alongside their football coverage. This international awareness, however, ultimately proved insufficient to meaningfully alter the course of events. FIFA, as football's global governing body, made no formal effort to investigate or address the political circumstances surrounding its host nation, and no major football federation ultimately withdrew its team from the tournament over these concerns, despite public debate on the subject in several participating countries beforehand. This institutional inaction, in the years since, has become its own subject of historical scrutiny, a case study frequently cited in discussions about the responsibilities international sporting bodies bear when selecting and maintaining relationships with host nations facing serious, well-documented human rights concerns. The 1978 World Cup's legacy has extended well beyond Argentina's own borders and its own reckoning with this period of history. Political scientists, sports historians, and journalists have repeatedly returned to Argentina 1978 as a foundational case study whenever similar concerns arise around subsequent major sporting events hosted by governments facing significant human rights criticism, drawing direct comparisons and lessons from how the 1978 tournament unfolded, how international sporting bodies responded at the time, and how, decades later, the host nation itself has grappled with the tournament's complicated dual legacy. In that sense, the story of Argentina 1978 has become something considerably larger than a single World Cup. However historically significant that tournament remains in its own right, it's become a reference point, cited again and again in ongoing global conversations about the relationship between major sporting events, political legitimacy, and the responsibilities that come with hosting and governing bodies alike when awarding these events to governments whose human rights records raise serious, credible concerns. Here are a few additional details from this story worth knowing. FIFA's scheduling controversy surrounding the Argentina-Peru match, allowing the host nation to know exactly what scoreline they needed before kickoff, directly influenced a rule change for the following World Cup in Spain in 1982, when FIFA restructured the second-round format specifically to prevent similar scheduling advantages from occurring again in future tournaments. Former Argentine finance minister Juan Alemán later claimed, in a detail that adds another layer of strangeness to the story, that an actual bomb had detonated somewhere in the vicinity, when Argentina scored their crucial fourth goal against Peru, sealing their advancement to the final. And Mario Kempes, the tournament's breakout star and top scorer, remains to this day one of the most beloved sporting figures in Argentine history. His personal legacy as a player has, for the most part, remained largely separate from the broader political controversy surrounding the tournament, in which he became a national hero. The story of the 1978 World Cup matters for reasons that extend well beyond football history, because it remains one of the clearest, most thoroughly documented examples of how authoritarian governments have historically used major sporting events to launder their international reputation, a practice that continues to be studied, discussed, and debated in the context of major sporting events held in politically repressive countries even today. Understanding what happened in Argentina in 1978 isn't about tarnishing the achievements of the players who competed and won a genuine sporting championship. It's about recognizing that sport doesn't exist in a political vacuum, and that the same tournament capable of producing authentic, unifying national joy can simultaneously be exploited by those in power for purposes entirely disconnected from the game itself. That tension between the purity of sporting achievement and the political forces that can surround and exploit it remains as relevant to how we think about major global sporting events today as it was in Argentina nearly 5 decades ago. Argentina won its first World Cup in 1978 in front of joyful crowds with a talented team that many football historians still regard fondly. And less than a mile from where they celebrated, a military government was running one of the most brutal periods of systematic repression in the country's history, using the very tournament being celebrated to help obscure that reality from the watching world. Nearly 5 decades later, Argentina still carries both of these truths simultaneously: genuine sporting pride and the enduring shadow of what was happening just outside the stadium walls. Understanding the 1978 World Cup means understanding both, not choosing one truth over the other. If this deep dive into one of football's most complicated, historically significant true stories was valuable to you, make sure to subscribe, because we're covering more of the sport's most consequential and thought-provoking real stories in the videos ahead. And in the comments, let us know your thoughts. How should sports history handle moments like this one, where genuine athletic achievement and political horror happen side by side?